Hades is the 4th highest rated game on Steam, like, period, across the tens of thousands of games there, including basically all my favorite games ever, or a whole bunch of them. We rate higher than all those. That's like it's a weird feeling.
Hades is like a game that isn't real. It's a title plucked from your dreams and made reality. It's fun distilled. It's carefully thought out mechanics and interactions that bend and twist but never break. It's color given life. It's dialogue that's unending and ludicrously situational. Even after having hundreds of hours under my belt, new dialogue is the norm. There's even specific text for reaching the final boss without any power-ups on you.
Odd. No stink of Olympus on you this time.
But unlike an actual dream game, Hades has the benefit of being real. You get to wake up, roll over, turn on your Switch or PC, and feel relieved that it's still there. And after you've cut your teeth on the first couple of hours, things click at a pace I've seen in few other roguelikes or video games. Because even if your moveset focuses mostly on 3 different attacks, what these 3 moves mean to you hinges so much on the weapon you choose at the beginning and the blessings you get throughout your run. One of the best examples of how your style can vary is in the Poseidon sword. Typically, your special attack for the sword is a ground-stabbing AoE used to bridge your standard attack combos together, but the Poseidon version of this sword has the added bonus of dislodging your magic projectiles from enemies when you use said special, since you'd normally have to wait for them to dislodge on their own or defeat them outright to get them back. This encourages you to constantly pelt your enemies with crystals before dislodging them with your special to get back in and do it all over again. Compare that to the normal version of this sword, which simply gives you increased attack and movement speed, and you have 2 completely different ways to use the same weapon. But even within one weapon aspect of one weapon type, the possibilities for different builds is plentiful. The gameplay loop for Poseidon's sword is optimal when casting and dislodging as fast as you can, but the type of cast you have will change how that gameplay loop persists. Using APHRODITE's cast with it will force you to get up close at the benefit of doing more damage and weakening your foes. And Athena's will do a fair amount of damage that deflects from afar, but with the downside that your projectile is slower. Yet even if you took the special effects like weakness and deflecting away from these 2 blessings, the cone shapes and projectile length of their attacks would still tug you in different gameplay directions. It is here that Hades absolutely shines, because despite its one nagging giant issue that I have, which I'll get to, the build diversity is unending. No matter how little I planned my moveset, I'd always find some way to interestingly feed one of my attacks into the other. Like using Dionysus's blessing on my special to inflict damage over time on multiple enemies so that I got a damage boost from bad influence, or inflicting delayed damage on enemies with my standard attack, and then using a duo skill with my special so that delayed damage is inflicted immediately instead. What is a duo skill? I'm so glad you asked. Some of the most fun I've had in RPGs or games with RPG elements is in crazy builds, and to say Hades has some crazy builds would be an understatement. You can hoard gold the entire run to deal tons of damage in the final fight, make a whole moveset based around pushing enemies into walls, or if you're this YouTuber, turn Hades into an idle game.
We did it.
But what especially helps facilitate crazy, cool combinations like this is the duo skills that combine traits from 2 different gods to make really powerful attacks, with these lightning-infused wine clouds from Dionysus and Zeus being my personal favorite. And sometimes the gods will even banter amongst each other before giving a duo skill to you, which lets you see the dynamic between these characters and get glimpses into the lore and story. And by all means, the story is well written, but far too often it feels constrained and doesn't take its characters in sharper and more dynamic directions. One plot thread in particular I liked was your stepmother Nyx forbidding you from seeing the Gorgondusa. It's a more hateful and bitter side of Nyx that we haven't seen before. Exploring her reasons for doing this and seeing other characters' reactions to it was one of the more intriguing parts of the story. Yet moments of intrigue like this don't happen enough. While the main plot thread has its moments, I think some of the most rewarding story beats of Hades had nothing to do with the mainline quests. Partially freeing your mentor Achilles of his duties so that he can be with the man he loves, and freeing Sisyphus of his chains was narratively satisfying, knowing that you freed these men of a really long cycle of pain and torment, or Achilles at least anyway. If you took a checklist of good story-making things, Supergiant probably checked, like, all of them. Yet the story ends up being barely above average at best, and I think I know partially why that is. The biggest weak point of the game's narrative is how stretched out it feels at times. It's more than fun enough to hold your attention for dozens of hours, but you'll get these long stretches of downtime where you'll feel like you're making no story progress. You have to reach the end more than a handful of times before you'll see the ending, and much more on top of that if you want to see the epilogue. And I understand that this stilted progression is partially due to the game having to stick to its endlessly cycling format of trying to escape the underworld, but too often I feel like I'm with a bunch of really developed characters that don't have enough going on. While it's nice to have new dialogue to see and experience even with so much time invested, the juicier story bits have been spread too few and far between. Whether the narrative or gameplay is worth trekking through Tartarus hundreds of times is entirely dependent on your taste, but I imagine the average player that puts tons of time into Hades will do so mainly because of the super tight combat, even if they're a little curious to see what waits at the end. Though even if you are having a lot of fun going to escape the underworld over and over again, it becomes clear at some point down the line that what you see is what you get. And that brings me ultimately to the biggest issue that I have with Hades. And it's that for as varied, fun, and multifaceted as the builds and weapons and characters are, the enemies are not so much. Don't get me wrong, you'll have to approach enemies that you fight in Elysium differently than the enemies you fight in Tartarus and so on, but the enemy pools of these areas are not the most sizable. Anyone expecting Binding of Isaac levels of content will be disappointed. Supergiant's take on what their game needs is very different than what the Isaac team deems fit for its game, with the final boss having been changed upwards of 5 times since Isaac Flash about 10 years ago. It becomes pretty clear that more is better as far as that team is concerned. Doesn't matter if you're reskinning an enemy 10 times over just to add more, even if it is to good effect. Conversely, Supergiant puts every single idea or enemy they want to put in the game through a strict vetting process until all that's left is the absolute best and relevant ones. Even if it does sound good on paper, this design philosophy did end in one of the biggest punches in the gut I've felt in some time, when Greg confirmed that there would be no ongoing content support for Hades outside of balance patches and fixes. And I respect this decision. And I don't. There's something to be said for putting a finished product out there and gracefully walking away, but in this day and age it's very hard for a game that isn't getting updated at least somewhat regularly to stand out. But I also understand that this should not be the norm. It's perfectly fine for a title to release and not be a constantly updating and shifting experience. And even without more content coming, Hades will probably continue to compete and hold relevancy with its updating competition on its pure quality alone. It's a rare thing to start playing a video game and slowly realize that it's one of your favorites you've ever played. It's an enchanting feeling that melted away the cold exterior of jaded adulthood and let me truly feel like a kid again. And honestly, anything that can do that is worthy of praise, in my opinion. Here's a video I did on stagger mechanics in video games. It's a cliche thing to say, but a like and subscription go a really long way in helping the channel get recognized. So if you enjoyed what you saw today, please do so. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful night. Bye-bye.